Bonjour et bienvenue à l'ILARA, l'Institut des langues rares de l'École pratique des hautes études PSL. Hello and welcome to ILARA, our institute, whose aim is to showcase the rare and precious, ancient and contemporary languages of the world. The interview with Professor DeLancey will be in English, but I'll introduce our institute in French first. L'ILARA est un institut tout nouvellement créé en août 2020 par un arrêté du ministère français de l'enseignement supérieur, de la recherche et de l'innovation. Sa mission est de sensibiliser et former le grand public aux langues rares, anciennes et contemporaines, et à leur culture. L'ILARA participe aussi à la valorisation et à la sauvegarde de ces langues à travers des actions de documentation. Deux offres principales sont actuellement disponibles pour tous les publics. D'une part, une offre de cours d'initiation, de découverte et d'approfondissement en présentiel à Paris et étant donné la situation en visioconférence. Vous y trouverez par exemple du tibétain ancien, des langues turciques, du géorgien classique et du gbaya, entre autres. Et d'autre part, une offre de vidéoconférence virtuelle, l'ILARA en ligne, disponible sur notre chaîne, et dont la première série, les invitations de l'ILARA, met à l'honneur des spécialistes de renommée internationale sous forme d'entretien ou de conférences. C'est dans le cadre de l'ILARA en ligne que nous accueillons aujourd'hui Scott DeLancey, professeur à l'Université d'Oregon aux États-Unis. Il est linguiste et spécialiste notamment d'une famille de langues appelée Tibeto-Burman. Il a travaillé toute sa vie sur les langues du nord-est de l'Inde, du Myanmar et du Népal, ainsi que sur les langues autochtones d'Amérique du Nord, en particulier une langue d'Oregon, le Klamath. Mondialement apprécié à la fois pour sa grande érudition et pour le caractère novateur de ses hypothèses de recherche, Scott DeLancey est également très engagé dans le soutien aux communautés et universités des pays dont il étudie les langues et met à leur disposition son savoir et ses compétences. Au cœur de sa démarche se trouvent les personnes et les communautés qui parlent ces langues et les institutions qui les étudient dans les pays où elles sont parlées. Vous pourrez à tout moment poser vos questions en français ou en anglais à Scott DeLancey à travers le chat en direct sur YouTube. Welcome to you all and please ask your questions in the live chat, share your comments and participate. This interview is also yours. Scott, a very warm welcome to ILARA. We are very happy and grateful that you accepted our invitation to open this series of talks and interviews.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This seems like a marvelous idea. As I've been saying to everybody every time I end up in this situation over the last few months, you know, it's for years now that we've been saying to one another, we need to take more advantage of the internet and internationalize things and set up conferences and events that people can participate in all over the world. And we just talked about it and never did it. And now we have no choice. And everybody's doing these things and look, it works. This is really fantastic.
Yeah, it's great. And thank you very much for being here. My first question is about your relationship with those languages and how you started working on them. Because for some linguists, what we hear is that they're known from their childhood on which languages they were going to study. But for you, it seems that there have been many coincidences and a lot of serendipity in your encounters with the languages you've been working on all your life. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah, that certainly is the case. You're describing people who've known all their lives what they wanted to work on. I guess I've known all my life that I was mostly interested in looking at the stuff that everybody else is ignoring. And that's kind of what I've ended up doing as a linguist as well. I was always interested in languages from the time I first realized that there are other languages where you can call a cat or a dog something else and people get the same idea from it. I really was introduced to linguistics by my father, who was an English professor, but but very interested in linguistics. He told me several times that if he had known there was such a thing as linguistics when he went to graduate school, that's what he would have done. So he gave me Sapir and Bloomfield and Jespersen to read when I was just in high school. And I was very excited about that. So that's why I wanted to do linguistics. And then I wanted to do historical linguistics. But before I did any of that, I went off and wandered around as a hippie for a couple of years. So when I started university, it was in the middle of the year. And I was in a hurry to start studying some exotic non-Western language, but you couldn't start in a class in the middle of the year. So I decided I would start with whatever they were offering in the summer. And at Cornell at that time, there was a 3-year rotation. One summer they would have an intensive Chinese course, one summer it would be Tamil, and one summer it would be Japanese. That summer it was Chinese, and I think that's how I ended up as a Tibeto-Burmanist, studying Chinese. And then if you're going to do historical linguistics starting with Chinese, you go to Tibeto-Burman. And then I started graduate school at Indiana looking at Tibetan and decided it was much more interesting than Chinese. And honestly, never really thought much about Chinese after that. And yeah, a lot of my running into different languages or taking up different languages has had some kind of external motivation like that. So while I was in graduate school, this was at Indiana, where there was, I guess still is, a long tradition of working on native North American languages. And so being a contrary sort of person, I kind of felt like, well, no, I'm not going to get involved in that. I'm just going to do my Tibeto-Burman stuff. And then long about the time I was finishing graduate school, my sister married a Dene fellow from Ashuk-Otine or Fort Good Hope up in Northwest Territories. They had a couple of kids, and I wanted to take my family up and visit, and decided, wow, you know, they still speak Ashuk-Otine up there, or what we used to call hair. I should do something about that. So that's how I ended up working on Dene or Athabascan languages. Ended up working on Klamath pretty much because I got a job at Oregon. And when I got to Oregon, I heard that there were still some Klamath speakers, and the tribe was interested in having somebody work with them. So kind of the opportunity was there. Yeah. Since then, of course, focusing on Tibeto-Burman languages and Venusian languages of the Northwest kind of leads you in a motivated path to different languages. So not everything was purely by chance, but still there's always this element. So my first PhD student, Carol Giannetti, went to Nepal to do her dissertation research. And when she left, she said, what would you like me to bring you back from Nepal? And I said, bring me back a Sunwar verb paradigm, because I really wanted a Sunwar verb paradigm. And after a few months, she wrote back. This was before there was email. And I got a letter that said, I got better than a Sunwar verb paradigm. I've got a Sunwar speaker who works in the local Apple store and really wants to come to America. So if we can get him set up, I can bring him with me. So that's how we ended up working on Sunwar for a while. What, you want other neat story? Oh, let me tell you my neatest story. So I started going to Northeast India in the mid-aughts because Jyoti Prakash Tamuli, professor at Gauhati University, and Mark Post and Stephen Morey from Australia were putting together the Northeast India Linguistic Society. And I had a PhD student, Gwen Hislop, who was interested in working there. So she went to their first meeting, came back and told me, well, you've got to go over there. There's all these languages and nobody's doing anything, and all kinds of local students who want to work on languages. You just need to go over there. So I went and visited, and I started visiting different universities. Is this story getting too long? Because this has a nice punchline.
Not at all.
Okay. So one, we don't have to go into the details, but one point of contention in the reconstruction of Tibeto-Burman has to do with how much verbal morphology we reconstruct. I've been the main advocate of reconstructing a lot, and there was this one outstanding problem, what looked like similar second person markers that in some languages are prefixes and in some languages are suffixes, and that's a little mysterious and problematic. And I had a theory for how that might have happened, and I kind of had an idea of exactly what the evidence would look like if I could find it. And I had sort of an idea that the place to find it might be in the South Central Kuki-Chin languages along the Indo-Myanmar border. And then on one of my visits to the Northeast, Manipur University Linguistics Department invited me to come and visit and give some lectures, which I did. And I got there, and the chair, Professor Yashwanta Singh, handed me a little sketch grammar he had just written, said, "I thought you might be interested in this." It was a grammar of Koireng, and it had exactly the form that I needed. And an hour later, the former department chair came by with 2 dissertations in her arms and said, "My students just wrote these dissertations. I thought you'd be interested." And one of those was my own, and it also had the exact form that I needed. And then they gave us time to talk, gave me time to talk to the PhD students, and one fellow, Koningle Wanglar, invited me to come down to his village down where the hills began to talk to the elders about language revitalization. And so I went down to talk there, and there was an elder, Mr. Egbert Kartu, who had written in English some little sketch of the language for local students. And by God, that had it too. And since then I found one more, but basically in this 1 week, people came to me with the data for 3 of the 4 languages that have exactly the crucial form that I needed to prove my theories and banish my opponents off into the wilderness. So I like that story. I like to tell that. You can probably tell.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story, and apparently you have questions in the chat along those lines, because someone, well, we have a comment that says Scott is looking great with Bodo Aronai and the coat, and also
I don't have an Aronai. Oh, they're looking in back. I've got Aronais hanging on my.
Okay.
Okay. The Aronai is a ceremonial scarf.
All right. All right.
Yes, was Bodo a coincidence?
Yes.
By this point, not exactly. Right. So I ended up in Guwahati. Take this a step further back. When I was writing my dissertation, I was doing comparative Tibeto-Burman morphology. And at that time, there was not much data published. And one of what seemed like the biggest gaps in the available data was for Northeast India. And at that time, in the 1970s, Northeast India was in the throes of several different insurgencies and was legally completely off limits to foreigners. And there was no practical possibility of anybody doing any field work there. So I just kind of forgot about that until, as I said, when my student Gwen went to Guwahati and came back and said, "Hey, it's workable now. People can do things there." Okay. And so I went to Guwahati, and at that point, I kind of needed a project, right? I wanted a language to work on. I always need a language to keep busy with. Now, Bodo is the largest and most politically important language other than Assamese in Assam. And that's one argument for it. But the real reason was that Professor Tumuli, who was my host there, said, well, you know, if you happen to want to work on Boro, I have 3 MA students, Prafula Basmatari, Krishna Boro, Bihung Brahma, who are all Boro speakers and seem like pretty good linguists. Maybe they could help. So that seemed like an opportunity, you know, just designed by the angels and brought from heaven, right? I've got 3 smart linguists who are native speakers of the language. Maybe we could do something. So that's kind of how I ended up doing Boro.
You have another question from the chat.
And what was the first Northeast language? That was also, well, that I worked directly on, that was also Boro. And that was the very first time that I visited Gauhati University. Professor Tumuli asked if I would do a little demonstration field methods course for a few days. And he offered me Prafula Basmatari as the speaker for that. So we worked on Boro. And I will say, working on Boro changed my ideas of how Tibeto-Burman languages work quite a bit. So it was very educational. So that's how I ended up working on Boro. And once again, one way of describing this is the opportunity was just sitting there waiting for me to show up. And when I showed up, there wasn't really any way not to do it.
And maybe some people are curious about the subtitle of your interview, because I asked you to provide a sentence that would somehow describe aspects of your work with languages, and you suggested, why would you want to do that? Or I don't know if the intonation is the right one.
Why would you want to do that?
Okay.
Right. And
Sorry.
yes, I can attribute this to many different people in my surroundings. Okay. To start with, of course, just in your general circle of acquaintance, lots and lots of people find the idea of wandering off into the parts of the world where nobody else goes to talk to the people there who nobody else talks to. People find this a little odd. Why would you want to do that? You know, I have people say, well, sure, you go to India. Did you go see the Taj Mahal? Well, no, I haven't. I spend all my time up in the hills. Why would you want to do that? Well, actually, I find it a lot more interesting, really. You get to meet all kinds of people that you wouldn't meet otherwise. You get to see all kinds of things that you wouldn't see otherwise. And then from linguists, and the truth is, partly the field has changed and partly I just insulate myself from people who don't see it the same way I do. But when I was first starting out, when I was a PhD student, it was widely said around linguistics departments in the United States, and advice that was repeated to everybody and that I and others heard over and over: do not do field work and write a grammar for your dissertation. You won't get a job. Which was true. Everybody I know pretty much who ignored that and wrote a grammar didn't find themselves with a career in academia. And the idea that was current at the time, this was in the generativist heyday, and many people would tell you the way that we do linguistic theory is we focus on one language, that we have native speaker linguists who can understand it deeply, and we just dig down to the bottom, and there we find our linguistic theory. And you could do this with any language, but we're doing it with English. That's your language. I remember my first year of graduate school, we had to write a syntax term paper, and I was starting to study classical Tibetan and had noticed that it was ergative, except that in those days, ergativity wasn't really an established idea. I think Dixon's paper was just out, but Comrie's wasn't yet. Right? So this was kind of mysterious. I wanted to work on that for my syntax paper. I went to the professor. I said, look at this interesting stuff. They looked at it for a few minutes and said, you know, maybe you should work on English for your first papers so that you don't get confused, which has never been an idea that appeals to me that much, frankly. And so I did, you know, I have always gotten a certain amount, or in those days, I got a certain amount of that from other linguists. Why do you want to go out in the jungle, right? You could work on French, you could work on Chinese, and sit in a nice hotel or a, you know, whatever. So there's kind of that point too. And the reason why, I mean, the answer to why is because you find things there that you don't find other places.
Thank you. Oh, I'm looking at the chat, and we have other questions as well. Which Tibeto-Burman languages have you worked on?
Oh,
is
dear
one
me.
of the questions. Yeah, dear you.
Well, if by work done, you just mean that I have sat with a speaker for a few days, that's a very long list. 4 or 5 Tibetan languages. Lhasa, Shigatse, 1 Amdo variety, Sherpa. Let's see, in Nepal, we've worked on Noir, Kathmandu Noir, Sunwar. Maybe that's all I've done directly. I've worked on a couple of languages from China, Troskyap, or also called Lavarung. I had a student, Yuhla, who was a Troskyap speaker who did her undergraduate degree at Oregon a few years ago. And then in India, oh goodness, Boro, Dimasa, Mishing, Monthang, Moyon, Chote, Tangkul. Honestly, I kind of, I can't remember all at once. I have published based on my own work on Tibetan, Jingpa, Burmese, Boro, Monsang, Toskyap. I don't know, a lot by now. I've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, and it's like naming friends and
exactly, right. Tell us all of the friends that you've enjoyed the company of over the last 50 years.
And you're going to forget someone, and that someone is very important to you. And
I'm sorry, what? Oh, yeah.
We have another question that overlaps with the one I was going to ask you, so it's really nice. Right. James Wells asks, I think it's a really important field. How do you describe the benefits to studying and revitalizing these less studied languages outside of linguistics?
Yeah. Okay, going back to the question about why would you want to do that? Back in the, even into the 90s, right, well into my career, when I started doing more work with local native tribes around Oregon and the Northwest on language revitalization projects and so on, I got a certain amount of, I suppose, well-intentioned skepticism from older linguists, basically saying, that's not your job. Yes, of course, those people do have problems with their language, and it would be very nice if something could be done, but actually nothing could be done. They're doomed anyway. And even if anything could be done, that's not your job. Yours, blah, blah, blah. Which I, on the one hand, found kind of ethically obnoxious. It seems pretty obvious to me that if a community is helping you with your research and there's some help that you could give them in return, that's kind of a natural way for things to work. But beyond that, let's ask the question, what is scholarship for? Why do any of us do this, right? You know, if you're talking about science, maybe you can go on about medicines and, you know, major machine, but why are we doing this? Well, it's because lots of people are curious about things. We are accumulating a body of knowledge for humankind, right? Well, you know, humankind isn't just the folks living in cities in Europe and North America. Humankind means everybody. And I will tell you, I've had skepticism about this before from the first world linguists who didn't really know what they're talking about. But the folks that you work with out in the community are really, really interested in what you're doing. They're really interested in their own language. They're really interested in anything you can tell them about its history. They're and, you know, I have many times by now around Northeast India had workshops for local folks, kind of showing them, you know, they say, what are you guys doing? Why are you here? And I show them, this is the stuff and they're really excited. They enjoy it. Same as everybody else. And if you think about it from a scholarly point of view, you know, many, not all, but many of the leading linguists who are experts, say, on English grammar, are native speakers of English. Many of the leading experts on French are speakers of French. Many of the leading experts on Japanese are speakers of Japanese. And our field really benefits from that, right? I think linguistics will be a much more healthier, vital field when some of our leading experts on Tibetan linguistics are Tibetan speakers. And well, we're just about, to tell you the truth, we're just about at a point where, well, no, we are at a point where some of the leading experts on Bodo linguistics are Bodo speakers. Now, with some of the smaller languages, that's not realistic, right? If there are 1,000 speakers of Tarao, I don't think, generally speaking, that you find 1 in 1,000 people anywhere who really want to be linguists. So we might not turn one up there. But the more that people are interested in what we're doing, the more interest there is in what we're doing, the more we cooperate with the communities, the more everything we do works together.
Yeah, I think we have a nice question in the chat here. What was the most challenging feature to elicit and to grasp as a native English speaker of any language you've studied?
Well, let me start by saying I might not know the answer to that, because probably the hardest is one that I haven't figured out yet and that I still think I know based on English. But the one, I guess, that I struggled the longest with and never really figured out myself, is the concept of egophoricity that we get in Tibetan, which is something I've been struggling with since I first started graduate school. So essentially what's going on here, there's a long tradition of thinking about language and the meaning of language in terms of some sort of a strict objective concept. So language is about describing reality and so on. But when human beings are communicating, what they're really communicating about is mental states more than the outside world. And one of the things languages do all around the world is when you tell somebody something, the grammar gives you ways of marking it for how sure you are. So this is what English does with will, may, must, might. How you know it. So this is evidential marking, but still English will do this with looks like, seems like, I hear, blah, blah, blah. Right. And in Tibetan in particular, they are very concerned with what we might call, what kind of knowledge is this? So there are some things that you know just because those are things that people know, right? So if I know that tigers live in Asia, well, the truth is I've never seen a tiger in Asia. I don't remember anybody in particular ever telling me that tigers live in Asia. That's what we know. That's part of our knowledge of the world, right? And then there are things you know because you went and saw them. And then there are things that you know because they are things that only you could know. So if I say I'm hungry, nobody can possibly contradict me. How could anybody else possibly know? Right? If I say there are tigers in Asia, I could be wrong. But if I say I'm hungry, I can be telling the truth or lying, but I can't be wrong. That's information about me. That's sort of the concept of egophoric. And I've been working on Tibetan for decades now, and I wrote a lot of papers basically trying to analyze that distinction as being evidential. And it really isn't evidential. It's really more about this idea of what kind of knowledge is it possible to have. And a lot of younger Tibetanists who know the language better than I do have gone on and developed the concept of egophoricity. The term comes from Nicolas Tournadre, a French Tibetanist. And that's all very well. That's how the field is supposed to proceed. But when I think about this, I remember back to Indiana when I was a graduate student, and I found my first native speaker consultant to help me with my own research on the language outside of classes. That was a newly arrived refugee named Thupten Anyat-sang. And by the way, all of you out there in YouTube land, if you ever find yourself in Bloomington, Indiana, which you might because that's where Indiana University is, don't miss the opportunity to have dinner at Anyat Sang's Little Tibet restaurant. It's on 4th Street. It's just 2 blocks from the main gate of campus, and it's a great place. Anyway, I remember part of what's going on in Tibetan, there are 2 different copulas, 2 different ways you can say there is something. And one of these is egophoric. Actually, there are several. There are quite a few. But there are 2 I was looking at. One is egophoric, and one is direct perception. Right. So one is I know this because it's about me, and one is I know this because I see it. And I was eliciting data from Thupten. And I asked him, how would you say there's a cat in my house? And he said, yeah, shimito. And I said, okay, what if I said shimiyu And he said, you'd say that if it's your cat, which is precisely the concept of egophoricity, which he was trying to explain to me. This is back in like 1976. I wasn't paying any attention. I figured this had to be evidential because that's the only thing I'd ever heard of that this might possibly be. And, Tupton really actually spent a lot of time trying to straighten me out about what these verb forms meant. And I never did get it. Basically, I never did get it until years and years later when other Western linguists had figured it out and explained it to me.
So it's so we have several questions in the chat, but I wanted to maybe develop what you just said, which is about the way speakers are really crucial in the way you work with those languages and the way they make you realize that there are some categories that you hadn't thought about before.
Mm-hmm. Why, you want another story?
Yeah, I'm sure you have plenty. Or yeah, this idea of speakers of rare languages being crucial in discoveries in the linguists' so-called discoveries, and all this collaboration, which it seems to me is very central to your work as a linguist.
Well, I could give you another similar story. There's this idea of Murativity, which I'm supposed to be the originator of, although that's not exactly true. And okay, for non-linguists in the audience, if we have any, this is basically that along with how certain you are of what you know and how you found it out and what sort of knowledge of the world it represents, languages also often give you the means to specify that this is something that was new information to me that made me kind of adjust my ideas of how the world is, even just a little tiny bit. Now, this is a nice example of a point that I like to harangue people with about how, for all that every time we teach an interlinguistics class, we always stand up the first day and tell them all about how in the benighted, ignorant ideas that you heard from your English teacher, that idea of grammar is really about written language, which is prime, but linguistics is about spoken language, blah, 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 right? But linguistics as we conduct it is indeed still very much in the thrall of old ideas of written language primacy. For example, the mirative category is one that is marked very clearly and unambiguously in English, except it's marked by intonation, right? So an ordinary sentence is, oh, John's gone to the bush. And a mirative sentence is, oh, John's gone to the bush. It is da-da-da, which marks something as mirative. But since that doesn't show up when you write an example down, it doesn't count. And nobody ever talks about it, right? And I had to, there's no category of mirativity for people to talk about until somebody finds a language where there's an actual segmental syllable associated with it, right? Well, the segmental syllable in Dene, in For Good Hope Dene that I was working on, is law. And this is where I found the idea of mirativity. So I told you the story of I was going to go up, take my family up to For Good Hope for a summer vacation and meet the cousins. And do some linguistic research, which I did. And this was just after Wally Chaffe's workshop on evidentiality in Berkeley, which I had gone to. And so my head was full of evidentiality, plus which I'd been working on that in Tibetan for years. And so I was kind of really hoping I was going to find evidentiality in Dene, because wouldn't that be cool, right? Sort of part of the message of the workshop that we'd been to was, this is all over, everybody ignores it, but just look, when you stop looking at Western Europe, there's evidence. So I thought, I'll find it. And so there is this particle law in Dene. And after many attempts to elicit evidential marking without any particular success, I sort of fastened on this and thought, well, maybe that's an indirect evidential marker or something. And I even kind of wrote about it that way a little bit until eventually I figured out what it really was, that it's really a meritive marker. But when I say I figured out, the fact is people told me that, right? So my English examples, John went to the bush, John went to the bush. These were examples that my consultant, Vicky Orley, had given me. I was asking her to explain what law does. And she said, law. And she said, and the law is there because you didn't know. So if you knew that John was planning to go to the bush and you go by his house and his skidoo is gone, that's not law. But if you didn't know he was going to go and you go by and it's gone, that's when you say law. Okay, that's basically the concept of murativity. Vicky explained it to me in 1982. And it finally, I guess, penetrated enough that I could write it up about 10 or 12 years later. Was that what you were asking? I don't know, I got carried away there.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's about, again, this crucial importance of consultants and working with native speakers. It also relates to what you said about grammars being written more and more by speakers of the languages themselves. And I think it's a great idea. Maybe to come back to questions that are less technical so that our larger audience can follow as well. I remember reading in your bio that since 2006, you've been working in Northeast India with local linguists to promote the documentation and description of the more than 150 tribal languages of the region. That, of course, is an approximate number. And the notion of language is something that
Yes.
people can relate to and are talking about a lot. So could you tell us more about how speakers delimit their languages and how this corresponds or not with how linguists define them?
Yes. This is a very complicated issue all throughout all of the Tibeto-Burman speaking area, Northeast India, Southwest China, a little bit in Nepal, I think. Yeah, so first of all, when we say, well, we don't really know how many languages there are someplace, people always ask, what, you mean there are languages that still aren't discovered? And actually the answer seems to be yes. I mean, obviously I don't know there's one out there waiting, but they keep turning up in Northeast India, Southwest China every few years, and nobody's really been to Northern Myanmar for a long time. So absolutely, there are languages that nobody has noticed yet outside of their local neighborhood. And then there's the dialect language question, right? So there are many, if you look at a list of all the languages in Northeast India, there are many pairs or sets of languages where there's actually very little difference among them. and they are really the names of communities as opposed to languages. And this is an issue that comes up around the world. People sort of automatically identify ethnicity and language. It's becomes a problem, for example, people use statistics from the Indian census to talk about how many speakers of various minority languages there are. But it's very common that, you know, if you are of Bodo ancestry, when the census comes around, you mark Bodo as your first language, even if you don't speak it at all. And so just to give a kind of very specific example, I work a lot in the state of Manipur, the easternmost state of India, right on the Myanmar border. There are maybe 30 languages spoken in this very small state, again, depending how you count. But among some groups, they count everything, and among other groups, they don't want to count any subdivisions. So in Chandel district, for example, every village just about insists that they speak a different language, even if they could actually carry on a conversation with one another. In Ukhrul district, on the other hand, people will tell you, we are all Tungkhul in Ukhrul district. Everybody speaks Tungkhul, there is one language here. Of course, there are 100 different varieties and nobody can understand each other, but it's all Tungkhul, right? Now, as a linguist, I really don't want to get involved in saying, well, now you guys are making too many languages and you guys are making too few. My official assessment is there are so many, because I'll just get in trouble. And anyway, I don't know any way to do that. But what that means is you can never come up with a final number for the number of languages, right? You can count the number of languages that people speaking them distinguish. You can count the number of languages that by some linguistic criterion would be different languages, and those will be different numbers. But those numbers can even change, right? So the same person might in one conversation tell you that two varieties are the same language, and in a different conversation insist that they're different, depending on what it is you're talking about, right? If we're talking linguistics, yeah, sure, they're the same. If we're talking politics, no, they're different.
Yeah, that's an issue that's really all over the place, over the world. This question of what's a language and how do we define them? And also, maybe from what you said, I also gather that a lot of people or communities in the area you're working on are actually in multilingual societies or are using several languages. So what's the situation for those multilingual
Oh, well, there are many different situations.
Mm.
Let me take a simpler situation for a second, which would be Southwest China. And in Southwest China, once again, there are many small minority languages. There's an official list, but there are many more languages that aren't on the list. And there's this extra problem that a lot of those communities, not all of them by any means, but quite a few of them are ethnically Tibetan, meaning they are Tibetan Buddhists, they have Tibetan customs, and so on and so on, and they consider themselves ethnically Tibetan. And some of these folks will insist that their home language is Tibetan, even though it isn't quite a different language. And others insist that it's different. And then Tibetan speakers tend to regard that as sort of splitting, right? We should all be Tibetan nationalists together and fight for one language, not for a whole bunch of different languages. right? So everybody in that region is at least trilingual. They speak their home language, they speak Tibetan, and they speak Mandarin. Well, when I say everybody, no, I can find people over 60 who don't know any. I can probably find people over 40 who don't know any Chinese. But younger people, everybody's at least trilingual. In India, in Northeast India, yeah, everybody's at least trilingual, but most people I know are conversant in at least half a dozen languages because you kind of have to be. Someone speaking a minority language in Manipur, like my Monsang friends, well, they speak Monsang, and they speak Meitei or Manipuri, which is the state language of Manipur. And they likely speak some Hindi. Certainly if they went to high school, they speak some Hindi. They likely speak some either Assamese or Bengali, maybe both. They very likely, if they come from one of the smaller tribes, can at least carry on conversations in one or two of the larger tribal languages. All right. And this is just normal. From what we hear, it doesn't seem like that used to be normal. Right? So nowadays, pretty much anybody in a minority language community anywhere is at least bilingual, because you have to know the local lingua franca, and if that's different from the state language, you have to know the state language. That's apparently only been true for a few generations. And back in the day, there were plenty of people living back in the forest who knew maybe their language and their neighbor's language, and that was about it. But of course, now everybody goes to school, everybody speaks all of the languages. This is one of the major threats to the home language, is that you very likely have a couple of languages available to you to carry on a conversation with anybody that you meet. And so people can fall out of the habit of using their home language.
Yeah, there are so many questions in the chat.
What have we got here? Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'll let you scroll through if you'd like, but otherwise.
I want to grab this one, social networking sites. Yes. Okay. Okay. Every place I go in Northeast India, well, not every place. Once I get out of the city and around to the villages, everybody is always concerned with what can we do to preserve our language. Right? People are very aware of the threat. They know their kids go to school and come home speaking a different language. They know if their kids are going to get anywhere in life, they have to leave the village and go to college, and they're going to speak another language there and blah, blah. And if they marry somebody from a different tribe. So this is a concern that's on everybody's mind. And this seems a little bit glib, but sometimes I tell people, you know, the salvation is your phone. Because one of the problems is the kids get out of high school, they go off to college in the city, they're hanging around with a bunch of people who don't speak Monsang or Chiru or whatever your local language is. So they're all carrying on in the lingua franca or in Hindi or whatever. If you got your phone, you can call home. Back in the day, you couldn't. Back in the day, if you were in the city, there was nobody you could speak your language to. That's not true anymore. You got your phone, you got Skype, you got Zoom, you got whatever you need. People were worrying about, oh, how do I, you know, the old people are passing away and all that. Take your phone, it's got a recorder on it, right? Go find Granny right now, ask her to tell you a story, get it on your phone. It's not a miracle, it's not salvation, but it's something. Then you have that, right? Then put it on a hard disk. There are a number of people now, both local and outside, around Northeast India working on building repositories for local linguistic data, oral literature, and so on. Anybody can collect this now. You got your phone, go do some language documentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if there are other questions from the chat, but if not right now.
I think you did have some of your own, right?
Sorry?
You did have some questions of your own, right?
Yeah, well, I'm switching from chat to my list of questions.
Okay.
So, but you mentioned multilingualism, and also I remember from the beginning of our conversation that you said you were very much interested in historical linguistics, and so I was wondering how this situation that's the case right now, what it was a few centuries before our time, and how does it explain some of the questions that you've been working on about languages of this area?
Well, the situation has changed. In a way, there's a recurrent situation all through this area, which has been going on throughout recorded history and probably before. So in the valleys, people start growing rice, and eventually you build up cities and kingdoms and states, and they conquer the whole valley, and establish a lingua franca, and the valleys then become pretty much monolingual. And anybody who doesn't participate in that is left up in the hills, which is where you find all of the multilingualism. And this has been going on at least since the early expansion of the Chinese state. But then 1200, 1500 years ago, the expansion of the Tibetan Empire, we are now beginning to see wiped out a whole lot of languages. The expansion of the Burmese kingdom over the last 1,000 years wiped out a lot of languages. The expansion of the Kamarupan kingdoms in the Brahmaputra Valley in Assam must have wiped out lots of languages. So there are lots and lots of languages that are simply gone. And historical linguists sometimes talk about this idea that you can determine the original location or center of dispersal of a language family by looking at the place that now has the most linguistic diversity. It's a terrible idea in general, not because the principle is wrong, but because if there's been any history since then, that has a way of disrupting that kind of pattern. And that most assuredly is the case for the languages that I'm working on. You can look at Chinese history, and the historians and the analysts will tell you, yeah, there used to be 1,000 different little states in Southwest China, and now there aren't. But presumably those were all languages as well. And then on the other hand, of course, there's all of this sort of later linguistic diversity. So when I talk about a branch like the South Central or Kuki-Chin languages, I would guess that's only divergent for the last 1,500 years, right? So it's about as old, about as deep in time depth as Romance, right? So if we go back 2,000 years, there were a lot more languages that have since disappeared, and then a lot of languages that hadn't yet diverged. I don't know if there's any real massive change over time. But I did mention being really surprised when I first worked on Boro, and why I was really surprised when I first worked on Boro is, well, actually I had seen Burmese like this, and Matasov's description of Lahu is like this in some of the languages, but it's absolutely regular. It's absolutely clean. Morphemes are what they are. It's one form, one meaning. You don't see languages like that very often. Chinese is notorious like that, but I've always had a suspicion that there's a historical reason for that. And indeed, there is a historical reason for Boro. It's pretty clear to me, if you look at the current distribution of Borogaro languages, and you just draw, I didn't give you this map, I should have given you this map, just draw a line around it. That outline is basically the borders of the Kamarupa kingdom in the first millennium of the Common Era, which tells me that Borogaro was the lingua franca of the Kamarupa kingdom, and lingua francas, of course, get smoothed out and regularized because so many of their speakers are not native speakers. That's the history of Borogaro. That's why Boro is the way it is. And truly, that wouldn't have occurred to me if I hadn't had the opportunity to work on Boro. It was sort of working on Boro at the same time as learning a little bit about Assamese history and saying, oh, this all fits together, actually. Isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm. And is archaeology of any help in this historical research or those hypotheses about this mixing history?
How do I want to put this? If anybody were doing any archaeology, I'm sure it would be very helpful. Okay. There are ruins all over Northeast India that I'm sure would tell us a lot about early urbanization. There's not very much work being done on it, unfortunately. I mean, there are places you can just go out in the woods and people say, look, see all these stones, this was blah. And nobody, it's not a known archaeological site or anything. So this is very frustrating. And even more frustrating is northern Myanmar, where, well, to be specific, for my recreation of the history of some of these languages, I really need to know more about the early urban civilizations in the Chindwin River Valley in 1,500 years ago. Right? At this point, we know there were such things, but I don't know that anybody is doing any research on them. So it would be helpful. So the answer is no, but not because archaeology isn't helpful, but because it's really hard to do archaeology in some of these places.
Yeah, thank you. So that's a call for more archaeologists working in the area.
Yeah.
And that would be great. I don't know if there are questions that you'd like to answer. There's one on revitalization. On one hand, language is an identity of community, a pool of indigenous knowledge. And on the other hand, language is a tool. How to manage these contradictory ideas in language?
Okay, I take that as yeah, there's always this issue as, okay, let me start by sort of talking about two different kinds of situation. One being where the language is still spoken, and what's basically happening now is that the current generation are orienting toward the cities, and we're going to lose all of this stored ancestral knowledge and so on. But then again, the situation, which there are some examples of also in Northeast India, but that we see all the time in North America, where there really is this gulf where the young folks who are now trying to revitalize the language never had a chance to learn it from somebody who was speaking it to them, right? And there's always this tension between, do we want to preserve this treasure exactly as it was handed down to us by our ancestors? Or do we want to use it so that it's part of our everyday lives in the future? And one area where this comes up is in new terminology, right? So if we are adapting any traditional language for use in the modern world, we have to be able to talk about phones and computers and internet and all sorts of things that undoubtedly there is no vocabulary for in the language, because there wasn't any vocabulary anywhere until, right? And so in those cases, do we borrow vocabulary from English, from the source language, from our local dominant language, which is a very practical solution? Or do we invent new terminology based on the language itself so that we are not distorting, right? And then you ask linguists about this and you get all kinds of answers. Linguists are always very quick to say, well, languages are always changing, and look at all the vocabulary that English borrows, and it hasn't. But of course, the case of English and the case of Klamath or Mozart or whatever are really not comparable in that respect. And there aren't good answers to these questions. These are issues every community has to kind of come to grips with, and the community has to give some serious thought as to what are we working on here, right? Are we preserving treasures from our ancestors like the masks or the shields or whatever that we hang on the wall and just look at? Or are we preserving a way of life and a way of thinking and something we're going to be working, you know? And it's not my place to tell you what the answer to that is, but it's something you have to think about, because you have to know what your goals are if you're going to make any progress toward them.
Yeah, you have new questions in the chat, at least 2 at the end.
Redefine the language group Porogaro? I'm not redefining it. I guess I don't understand the question. Okay, language becoming a simple lingua franca. Oh, maybe I should define terms here, right? The term lingua franca originally was a language. It was called lingua franca, which is the language of the Franks, and it was the commercial and trade language around the Mediterranean in Renaissance times. And so it has become a term for the language that everybody uses in a situation where everybody has their own language. So it's not necessarily official. It's not necessarily a Creole. It's not necessarily anything. It's just by definition the language that you use when you're talking to somebody who has a different native language than yours. So we can talk about English as a worldwide lingua franca and so on. When I say that Proto-Borogaro started out as a lingua franca. I actually have a slightly more elaborate story here. What I suspect, and I don't have a lot of evidence for this except it makes a nice story, but my story is, we know there was a state level kingdom called Pragjyotisha and then Kamarupa in the Brahmaputra Valley going back 2,000 years, probably more. We don't really know who the rulers of that were. They claimed to be Indo-Aryan speakers, and they have some inscriptions in Sanskrit. There might be some reason to be skeptical of that, but I'm pretty sure that their armies were speakers of Tibeto-Burman languages. Indeed, the Mahabharata describes the armies of Pragjyotisha, and it says that they were Kirantis and Lechas and Chinese. Well, they certainly weren't Chinese. That's probably a comment on the fact that a lot of Northeast Indians look East Asian. But the Lechas, those are the Borogaro people, and that's pretty clear. So what I think is you had an army which was composed of people from many different communities. The language of the army was Proto-Borogaro, so everybody spoke it. Since that would have included lots and lots and lots of people who didn't speak it natively, that's how the grammar got regularized. And, you know, I assume a history 2,000 years ago, kind of like the situation now, where everybody knows their own language and Assamese, and then over time, more and more people just know Assamese and give up on their own language. And so you can see Bodo communities kind of giving up Bodo, and well, that's where Borogaro came from. So Proto-Borogaro was the language people were shifting to 2,000 years ago. Which means that, there's this, people in Northeast India are fascinated with the question of where did we come from? And the Bodos talk a lot about where did the Bodos come from? And there's a story floating around that it's Mongolia, which I'm quite sure is a story they got from the British and not something that comes from local tradition. But the reality is the Boros formed in the Brahmaputra Valley in Assam through the coalescence of different groups that were there already. Before they came to Assam, they weren't Boros. They were speaking a language that's ancestral to Bodo, right? In exactly the same way that if we talk about the English people, we don't say the English people came from the steppes of Central Asia. I mean, the English language traces back to Proto-Indo-European, which was spoken in the steppes of Central Asia, but we don't call anybody English until they're in England. Sorry, I'm preaching again. I get a little carried away with some of these points from time to time.
That's what happens when you're passionate about something and there's a lot of discussion going on, especially with speakers and I really appreciate the way you think about all those historical events in a very incarnated way. So how would people, what would people do? Thinking about the army, thinking about events actually happening. I think it's one of the things when you're working on living languages in specific area where you go very often and you meet people and discuss things with them a lot. So
yes, one of the things that comes through doing any kind of field work is that in objective reality, languages are not disembodied symbol systems. They are behaviors carried out by a group of people, and those are people. And as the people behave, you talk about language changing. Well, what's happening is the people are changing the way they behave. And a lot of linguistics is trying to purify our idea of grammar and sort of expel all of this personal human part from it. And that was a good exercise. That's kind of linguistics of the 20th century. But I think now that's given us about as much as it can. And at this point, we need to go back to understanding that what we're talking about is how people behave in communities. Historical linguistics is a story about how people's behavior changed in a community over time for whatever reasons.
And talking about people, there's also something I wanted to ask you about, which is, do you have in mind anecdotes or stories about memorable speakers or language activists that you've been working with?
Oh, I know one or two of those, yeah. Probably the first one that I should talk about is Virginia Beavert. Mrs. Beavert is a speaker of Ichishkin, otherwise known as Yakima Sahaptin, a language spoken in the Columbia River Valley and now around the Yakima Indian Reservation in Washington State. When we first put together the Northwest Indian Language Institute at the request of local tribes in the 1990s, to try and provide training for people from local tribes who wanted to work on language revitalization, Virginia was a mainstay. She was already an early language activist, and so we very badly wanted her help, and she was very enthusiastic and has worked with us ever since. Now, Mrs. Beavert, and now I can't remember exactly how old she is. She's well in her 90s. And I'll tell you how I know that in a second. But her father was a consultant for the first linguist who ever worked on those languages, the University of Washington. And Mrs. Beavert remembers him coming around. She was a little kid. And it turns out that since that time, Mrs. Beavert has been a consultant or in some way really central to all of the research that's been done on Sahaptin language and culture since then, by which I mean everybody who wrote a dissertation on the people or the language used Mrs. Beavert and wrote their dissertation with her help. And, you know, when we were working, hanging around Neely and so on, once I heard her say kind of jocularly, yeah, so where's my PhD after all that work? And I thought to myself, yeah, where is her PhD? Huh. Anyway, Mrs. Beavert has a PhD, an earned doctorate. We had her basically write unrecorded episodes of her life story and memories of Yakima culture in English and Ichishkin. turned it into a dissertation. She got her PhD over the age of 90. She was the oldest PhD recipient in the history of Oregon, and possibly, I don't know, I saw a note somewhere that said anywhere in the United States. I don't know how true that was. But anyway, I was really excited about that we got Mrs. Evert her PhD. And that didn't stop her. She's still working with Nili. She's still helping, she helped us create an Ichishkin language class at the University of Oregon. She taught it for the first couple of years and trained the teachers who are teaching it now. So that's somebody that I would absolutely mention. Who else can let's see, I should mention my dear friend, Moshel Kaling. So Moshel is someone I met in Manipur. And this is kind of an interesting thing, there's sort of this lore around field work where there's this very difficult initial step of heading out to wherever you're going, finding a community, making contact. That's not what my life has been like in Northeast India. Since the first time I came here, people just keep coming to me. Right? So the first time I went, I visited Professor Tamuli in Guwahati University, and he arranged an interview with a local newspaper and talk about languages. I went back to Oregon. This is what, 2006 maybe, and a couple of weeks later, I got an email. Dear sir, this is Di Taron from the Karbi community in Assam, where you were last month, and I saw the story about you in the newspaper, and the Karbi Literary Association really wants somebody to come and work on our language. Could you find us somebody? So I had a PhD student who was looking for a language. That was Linda Conant, and she worked on Karbi. Wrote a prize-winning grammar of the language. So Mr. Taron, since that time, he's been, well, actually not since the time, before that time, he was already a Karbi language activist, going all around collecting folklore. He set up the situation for Linda. So when my student went there, they had arranged housing for her. They had arranged a meal plan. They had found language consultants. They had found a research assistant, and they were paying all those people. They were so excited about this. They basically paid for the whole project. And again, this is all Mr. Taron's initiative, and he's still working on it today. So that's absolutely somebody worth mentioning. I should tell you about Banwang Losu, someone else I met in Northeast India. He is from the Wancho community, and among other things, he completely on his own initiative created a script for Wancho. It's a fascinating, I mean, it's its own alphabet. Oh, and then I absolutely have to tell you about Moshel Kaling. Oh yeah, this is where I was ending up. I got off on a tangent. Okay. So when I was in Manipur, and I was in the small village of Liwa Changning, visiting my Monsang friends, and from time to time, people would just stop by, drive into the village, come over to Koningly's house where I was staying, and say, "You're interested in languages? We have a language. Should be interested in our language." And one of those was Moshel, and his language is Ipo. And it's a small language spoken by a couple of thousand people. And going back to the question we were talking about, how many languages are there? What are the names? Another problem that comes up here is the Wipo belong to a larger tribe, the Meringue tribe. And on all of the official lists, they're not listed separately as a tribe. They're part of Meringue. And therefore, the majority Meringue people feel like we're Meringue, we all speak Meringue, and resent anybody claiming, well, we have a language of our own. Right? Moshel, all his life, has been kind of a Wipo language activist. All of the folks up there in the hills where I go are Baptist. And Moshel started out by taking the local hymnal and translating it all into his own language. Right? This is a language, few thousand speakers, had never been written down yet. Nobody had ever studied it at all. Right? And he continued, he's collecting folklore again and so on, and was trying desperately to teach himself linguistics. And one of the ways he would teach himself linguistics was whenever any linguist, there was a linguistics department at the university there, and every once in a while, somebody from Delhi would come through and Moshe would grab them and try and show them his language. And so I was there, and he grabbed me, went over to his house, and we started looking at all of this stuff that he had done on his language. And to a linguist, the really impressive thing about somebody like that is he's kind of inventing linguistic analysis on his own. He didn't, no idea how to do this, but he's showing me all of these different forms and the way he'd broken up the verbs and so on. And since then now, Pavel Ozerov has been working in the area, and he and Moshel have been working together on Wipo. There are actually there aren't hundreds of these people, but there are more than you think, and they keep popping up. People who just realize somehow that somebody needs to do something about our language here. I don't see anybody else. Maybe I'll do it.
Sorry, this is probably something that's really crucial and important right now, that people should document their own languages more, and given what's happening with dwindling of linguistic diversity and everything that's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. There's absolutely no reason whatever for anybody to be sitting around waiting for some scholar to show up from outside to tell you how to do this. Okay, there absolutely is useful advice you can get from a linguist. So you probably are not going to get very far with real grammatical analysis without some education in linguistics. But what you can do is you can record stories, you can record conversations, you can record procedures. Okay, one thing, well, a whole lot of things people just aren't doing anymore. They're not doing old agricultural things. People aren't going out hunting anymore. People aren't building houses traditionally anymore. You can find any place where somebody can even just walk through how to build a traditional house and talk about it in the language, record it. We'll never get that information again. You can do it right now. Everybody has a phone anymore.
Yes, this is very true. I don't know if there are other questions in the chat for you. I can't hear you, Scott.
Come on, I'm not saying anything.
Okay.
The only one we haven't gotten to is the one about whether obligatory evidentiality would make you a better scholarly writer.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I should say that, you know, we're taught to be very explicit about information source anyway. And if you try and fudge that, the reviewers and the editor are supposed to catch you. So I don't know that we really need some kind of Orphean story. However, I actually did notice, as I learned more Tibetan and started learning more about evidentiality, I did for a while find myself noticing the absence in English and feeling like, oh, I really need some way to tag that. Of course, we do have all kinds of things for that, but they're all just sort of semi-lexical, semi-grammaticalized. Right? These little seems like things. And you can't do that in academic writing.
So I think there were a few questions I had about categories and language internal analysis, but I don't know whether you'd like to.
We can do that. I'm
Okay.
still awake. It's still lunchtime where I am. This isn't going late or anything.
Okay, so up to you.
No, go ahead.
No, well, if it's about this linguistic analysis that we mentioned at the beginning, the categories, the Murativity, evidential, and so on.
Okay.
How do we, as linguists, discover categories? How do we consider categories as primarily about form or primarily about function?
Of course, as people are chattering about a lot these days, the whole notion of category is a little bit squishy. When we're talking about things like evidentiality and Murativity, these are like functional categories. These are things that a language might want to do, as opposed to, say, things like detransitivization, which are structures, right? And in my experience, the only way that I've ever thought of anything new was by trying to figure out either a problem in a language I was working on or some kind of a historical problem. So I've written a lot about what we now call hierarchical alignment and inverse marking and so on. And the reason is, oh yeah, back to my story and chance encounters with languages. Right? So I went to graduate school at Indiana University, and my advisor, the Department of Linguistics at Indiana University, was Laurent Moran, who was a Jingpo, a speaker of Jingpo, which is an influential Tibeto-Burman language from northern Myanmar. So I started right out working on Jingpo. And by golly, Jingpo has hierarchical alignment, and it agrees always with the first or second person instead of third, and all of these sorts of things. I've told you the story of Murativity. It's not like I was looking for it. It was there in a language that I was trying to understand, and my very patient and helpful language consultants just kept banging on my head until I woke up and noticed what they were trying to show me. And indeed, every idea I've ever come up with comes out of trying to solve some problem. And what is that morpheme? What are they doing with that? Or some kind of comparative problem. In other words, my approach to everything actually is always very inductive. Right? I'm not starting out with a theory and looking for examples. I'm just sort of wandering around in the most remote place I can find, picking up interesting things and trying to figure out if there's a pattern to them.
Oops, sorry. I think we're being...
Yeah, the technology may be slowing down, even if we aren't.
Yeah. In relation to this, there's this notion of language internal versus comparative concepts, language internal categories. So what do you think about this? What's your stance about what's most important, or maybe depending on the perspective that a linguist has?
Again, ultimately, I think this ends up with us having to be more realistic about thinking of language as patterns of behavior. And not as sort of abstract systems. Okay, now I've lost my train of thought. Remind me where I started here.
We were talking about the language internal versus comparative concepts.
Oh yeah, right, concepts. Yes. And what we're so the stories I've been telling about, looking at ideas like egophoricity and murativity and so on. What makes these new ideas is that 50 years ago, it wouldn't occur to anybody that those would be things people would be talking about. Even though, of course, everybody talks about that every day. And the reason it wouldn't have occurred to it is because, once again, linguistics has always sort of in the back of our minds been thinking of written language and not spoken language. But spoken language is a negotiation between individuals about trying to come up with some sort of a shared representation. Okay. And the comparative concepts are the things that keep coming up that people want to specify. So if we talk about tense as being a concept that shows up in languages all around the world, what we're really saying is that as people are interacting, that's one of the things they want to keep track of. If we want to talk about modality, that is degree of certainty, evidentiality, source of knowledge, egophoricity, generic types of knowledge, so on, murativity, attitudes toward knowledge, and so on. Why these keep coming up is because we're just paying more and more attention to the fact that when people are talking, they're worrying about these things. And so the comparative concepts, in a sort of a very vague way, end up being the things that human beings in general like to keep track of when they're interacting with each other. And then our language particular concepts are going to end up being particular strategies that different communities end up with for doing these things.
I think we have a question from the chat right now. I mean, one question is general, and maybe we'll keep it for the end of the interview, but the other one is more specific. There is evidentiality in the languages of Nepal, both in Indo-Aryan and Tibeto-Burman. Is it an areal typological feature?
Within Nepal, yes, certainly. That is, yes, it's true that we find similar distinctions cropping up in neighboring languages of very different families. And when we see that, we usually think this is aerial influence, because that's the simple explanation for it. It does seem to be pretty focused in the Himalayas. So I don't find a lot of evidentiality in the rest of Northeast India. Potagara languages don't really do it. The South Central languages, the Naga languages don't really do that much. So yeah, it does seem to be something kind of focused around the Central Himalayas.
Mm-hmm.
Chat question, any plan to visit India soon again? You know, I was supposed to be there now, but something came up. And how shall I put this? Speaking as I am from my hidden location in the country that seems to have managed to do absolutely the worst job in the world of dealing with a pandemic, and talking about the idea of visiting maybe not the second worst, and I don't want to insult anybody, but India is not really doing a very good job either. I don't know. Yeah, I really, you know, absolutely come back to India again, but soon, I don't know, if the world doesn't end. Yeah, probably. Well, but I can't make any plans right now because I can't go anywhere because I'm an American, so nobody will let me into their country. I guess I could go to Serbia, and then maybe from Serbia I could sneak into India. It sounds risky. I think I'm just gonna wait.
Yeah, I think it's a good option to wait a little bit more and be optimistic about the future. So if maybe if there aren't any other questions, we can, oh, there's someone crying on the chat. So unhappy that probably you're not coming so soon to visit.
Well,
sorry.
you know, if you could make the arrangements, right? You can give me all the permissions and everything. I could probably be talked into it, but I don't think it's going to work.
Okay, so maybe we can wrap up at this point.
Okay.
It seems like there are less people in the chat. Someone is saying we can wait with a wide smile in the chat. So yeah, I think you'll be very much expected and welcomed when you go back soon. I hope.
I'm looking forward to that. Absolutely. Yeah, maybe on the way I can stop in France again, but that's also not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah. So we'll be so happy to see you in real life and do something else than have Zoom meetings, maybe go for a drink and lots of pleasant things like that. So, so Scott, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's been really wonderful to have you for this first ILARA interview. And also many thanks to all the people who watched us and interacted through the live chat. It's been really nice to have all this interaction, especially for a first broadcast for ILARA. So thank you very much. And we will meet you again next Thursday, this time at 9 in the morning, Paris time, so as to accommodate a guest from another time zone, Professor Nicholas Evans from the Australian National University, who is going to introduce us to the languages of Australia, and in particular, one of them, Dalabon. So thank you again, Scott. Thank you, everyone. And see you next Thursday then.
Good night, everyone.